Dr. Oppenheimer, nevertheless, with all the rationalization, with all the inevitability of the decision that history demonstrates to us, you and many like you who brought the bomb into being still seem to suffer, may I say, from a bad conscience about it. Is that true, sir?
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy.
It's going to work all right, Robert, and I'm sure we'll never be sorry for it.
That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
I believe we had a great cause to do this, but I do not think that our consciences should be entirely easy.
The front of this school is a quarter of a mile from and faces 0 Point. This reinforced concrete building was knocked sidewise, causing the lower story to collapse.
History has given J. Robert Oppenheimer many names, but none have stuck quite like the destroyer of worlds. But how does one man, one civilian no less, come to earn such an ominous moniker? And does he really deserve it? Or should it instead be given to someone else? Perhaps even a US president? Let's find out. In 1942, amidst the backdrop of the Second World War, physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer is named as the scientific director of the top-secret Manhattan Project. He is now tasked with entering the US into a race against the Germans to be the first nation to develop an atomic bomb. The project needed a base of operations, so deep in the New Mexico desert, the Los Alamos Laboratory was established. And so began the journey to develop a new superweapon, a task that would take years to complete. It is now spring 1945, and the first atomic bomb is almost ready to be tested. However, Germany is all but defeated, leaving many Manhattan Project scientists uncertain of what their new weapon will be used for, or whether it'll even be required at all. However, while the main Axis power nears its demise, there still remains one enemy who refuses to give up the fight. Despite losing most of its recently occupied territories and suffering staggering casualties, Japan fights on, even after it becomes clear that they will never win victory over the Allied powers. The Americans begin formulating a plan to deal a final blow, but amidst this planning, President Roosevelt dies and is replaced by Harry S. Truman, who is quickly briefed on the Manhattan Project and its atomic bombs. As the new president, Truman will have the final say on whether to use these new weapons, which have the potential to finally crush Japanese resistance. But at this time, they remain untested and their war-ending capabilities are just a theory. So, for the time being, a plan to invade mainland Japan is put into motion, the D-Day set for November 1st, 1945. Back at Los Alamos, discussions continue on how to use the atomic bombs, assuming they even work. An interim committee chaired by Secretary of War Henry Stimson comes to the conclusion that the bombs should be used on Japanese cities without warning. And on June 1st, the committee delivers their recommendation to the newly appointed President Truman. However, many of the scientists involved with the project are horrified with the committee's findings and suggest instead that the power of the weapon be first demonstrated to Japan by dropping it either over water or a non-populated area. On the surface, this seems like a very reasonable alternative to the mass killing of civilians. So why were these scientists' wishes ultimately ignored? Well, let's hear what those involved with making the decision to drop the bombs had to say in hindsight. The dominant claim by those who supported dropping atomic bombs on Japanese cities was that they did not believe a harmless demonstration of the weapon's power would suffice, and that anything short of destroying one or more population centres would do little to weaken the resolve of the Japanese leadership. This desire to bring an immediate end to the war was fueled by estimates suggesting that not only would an invasion of the Japanese home islands cost the lives of up to 1 million American servicemen, but that such an invasion would not end the war until fall 1946. These claims were backed up by intelligence reports suggesting that Japanese leadership had no intention of accepting the unconditional surrender which the US was currently demanding, and that they were well prepared to defend against a land invasion of the home islands. The US had also been made aware that Japan was trying to work with the Soviets to negotiate a more favourable surrender deal, which would see them retain both sovereignty under their emperor and territory conquered during the war. These reasons are not the whole story, however, and we will return to other darker, more self-serving explanations which were also at play later in the story. But what did Oppenheimer think? Did he support those such as Secretary of War Stimson in their belief that the atomic bombs should be used with maximum effectiveness and without warning? Or did he, like many of his colleagues, believe that a harmless demonstration was the most humane and reasonable course of action? Well, this is perhaps in part where Oppenheimer's Destroyer of Worlds reputation comes from, as records and the physicist's own words seem to put him firmly in the first camp. In interviews conducted after the war, those who were present in meetings surrounding the use of the bombs stated that Oppenheimer came to believe that a harmless demonstration would not suffice, and that unless the weapon was used with maximum impact, it might be difficult for anyone to see the difference between it and the firebombing raids that were already devastating Japanese cities. Oddly though, when fellow Manhattan Project scientist Dr. Edward Teller wanted to speak out against the use of the bombs on cities, Oppenheimer advised him not to do so, as he did not believe that it was proper for scientists to speak on such issues, despite he himself having done just that. Even 2 decades after the war, Oppenheimer maintained that while he did not like the idea of his invention having killed innocent people, he believed that dropping the bombs was ultimately the right thing to do. So, was it? Or are we justified in viewing those who supported the massacre of over 100,000 Japanese civilians as monsters? This is the question which has been discussed perhaps more than any other in the 20th century, and for good reason. On one hand, we do know that Japan was not ready to accept unconditional surrender, and that the policy within Japanese leadership was to punish anyone who suggested agreeing to such terms in order to maintain unity amongst the ranks. Many Japanese military leaders remained confident that the over 6 million troops they still controlled could deal a large enough blow to American invasion forces to pressure the US into a negotiation where Japan might avoid occupation, keep conquered territory, and maintain sovereignty under their emperor.
Our conclusion was that if the Americans landed on southern Kyushu, our present forces alone would be sufficient to fight off the Americans.
The US, however, believed that the only way to ensure Japan would not be a threat in the future was to completely disarm her and install a democratic government. So, after the Trinity test proved that atomic bombs were indeed as powerful as had been hoped, the US immediately shifted its focus from an invasion to the use of atomic bombs on Japan.
All of a sudden, an incredible flash of light illuminated everything many times brighter than sunlight does in New Mexico at noon on a bright day. Many miles of the desert were completely blinding, and so I actually lost my vision for a few seconds. When it recovered, I turned back, and I saw a huge ball of fire, bright yellow, rising through the atmosphere. And the whole atmosphere, in the direction of the bomb, was filled with strange violet light.
After one final plea to surrender was ignored by Japanese leadership, Truman gave the order to begin ticking off the list of Japanese cities to be destroyed with these new weapons. And on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was dragged into the nuclear age by a bomb the likes of which the world had never seen. However, despite this bomb killing roughly 80,000 people, Japan did not ask for an immediate surrender. And when news of the second bombing at Nagasaki reached Japanese leadership, it was only briefly discussed. Which now brings us to some important arguments against the use of the bombs. There are 2 reasons why Japanese leaders may have paid little attention to Nagasaki's destruction. The first being that the firebombing campaigns undertaken by Allied bombers had already claimed the lives of far more civilians than both of the atomic bombings combined. In fact, almost as many people were killed in just a single firebombing raid over Tokyo than perished in the initial atomic blasts at both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The other reason why the atomic bombing of Nagasaki may not have prompted the Emperor's surrender is that just hours before the bomb was dropped, a newly hostile Soviet Union had launched an attack on Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a battle which Japan stood no chance of winning. Importantly, this attack also signaled the end of Japan's hopes to negotiate a peace through the Soviet Union. Renowned historian Ward Wilson argues that this invasion, not the dropping of the atomic bombs, was the deciding factor in the surrender of Japan 8 days later on August 15th, despite the Emperor citing a new and most cruel bomb in his surrender announcement. Wilson goes on to suggest that given the Americans knew a Soviet invasion of Manchuria was imminent, the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is difficult to morally justify. Oppenheimer, for his part, hoped that these live demonstrations of the destructive capabilities of atomic weapons acted as a deterrent in later years, preventing future wars and ultimately saving many more lives than those lost in Japan. Whether this is true or not is another hotly debated question amongst historians, and as long as we continue to live in the age of nuclear weapons, we may never get a definitive answer. Now, if we want to get closer to understanding how Oppenheimer saw his role in the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this famous 1965 interview perhaps provides his clearest explanation.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
Oppenheimer's reputation as the father of the atomic bomb has led many to conclude from this quote that Oppenheimer saw himself as death, destroyer of worlds. But according to historian James Jaya, Oppenheimer saw himself not as the god Vishnu, but as the prince who Vishnu convinces to go to war, destined to fulfill a terrible duty. After the war, Oppenheimer became an outspoken proponent of international regulation over all atomic technology in an attempt to prevent a nuclear arms race, and he strongly opposed the creation of a hydrogen bomb, the destructive power of which dwarfed that of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. This helps make Oppenheimer, if nothing else, a complicated figure, a man who on one hand proclaimed after the destruction of Hiroshima that his only regret was that the bomb wasn't ready early enough to use against the Germans, and on the other, reportedly believed the second bombing on Nagasaki to be unjustified, prompting him to tell President Truman, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Let us now close by returning to the reasons why the bombs were dropped. We have already heard from those who made the decision as to their own justifications, but were there reasons which they may not have wanted to admit influenced their choices? Well, firstly, General Groves, commanding general of the Manhattan Project, stated in a 1965 interview that the blood of any Americans who died after the bomb was ready for use would have been used against President Truman in any future election, giving the president a strong political incentive to use the new weapon as quickly as possible. Secondly, it is now widely believed that particularly the second bomb, dropped on Nagasaki, was at least in part a way for America to demonstrate her new military dominance to an increasingly hostile Soviet Union, as fears of a conflict between the two nations were rapidly gaining validity. Modern historians now also ask the question, to what extent did racism play a part? Given the feeling amongst many Americans during the Second World War that Japanese people were less than, is it perhaps fair to say that given the opportunity, America would have been less eager to use atomic weapons on a European city? Finally, a question which seems to receive almost no attention is what would those living in Japanese-occupied territories have thought of a debate over dropping atomic bombs on their oppressors? Come spring 1945, the US was ready to use any means available to end the war, in part to appease the American public, who by this time were war-weary and tired of their men dying in combat. Their suffering, however, while great, pales in comparison with many of those who had survived Japanese occupation thus far. For example, just one campaign in China saw Japanese troops horrifically massacre 250,000 civilians before using chemical weapons to poison wells and fields so that any future inhabitants of the now decimated region would likely become horribly sick. This is not to say that the massacre of one civilian population justifies that of another, but I can't help but wonder if those who had witnessed the sickening atrocities carried out on their countrymen by Japanese occupying forces would not have hesitated to end their subjugation by any means necessary. Questions like these are what make picking a side in this debate over the use of the atomic bombs on Japan so complicated. Let's say, for example though, you have decided that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki represent a cruel and unjustifiable act. On whose shoulder will you place the blame? You are now faced with a dilution of responsibility which makes pointing the finger at any one individual almost impossible. On one hand, Oppenheimer oversaw the creation of the bombs. However, he was just one of hundreds of Manhattan Project scientists and had negligible say in how his invention would be used. So how about military and political leaders like General Groves and Secretary Stimson? Well, they certainly supported using the bombs on cities with large civilian populations. But this support was based on intelligence gathered from reliable sources about Japan's unwillingness to surrender and the potential cost of an invasion. Also, while they did, unlike Oppenheimer, have the power to influence how the bombs were used, they too ultimately did not have the final say on if they would be used. President Truman did, however, and as he supposedly said of his meeting with the distressed Oppenheimer after Nagasaki's destruction, "I told him the blood was on my hands, to let me worry about that." So perhaps there lies the answer. But even then, we enter a new debate over culpability, similar to that surrounding JFK after the Bay of Pigs disaster 16 years later. This debate essentially boils down to one question. If a president enters office and almost immediately is advised to make a particular decision on an existing, highly volatile situation by advisors far more knowledgeable on that situation than he, is that president truly to blame? Thank you so much for watching and indulging my slight obsession with the fascinating and horrifying history of the Second World War. Have a great day, and please consider subscribing to help me to continue to make these videos far into the future.